Hi everyone, welcome back to Lifting the Lamp, and in this video I'm going to be talking about some of the spiritual themes that surround the Christmas season yet again. It'll probably be close to Christmas by the time I publish this. I'm wearing a festive green shirt to mark the occasion. One thing that particularly gets spoken about a lot, particularly by pagans at this time, and even atheists, probably more so atheists, is that there are elements of Christianity, there are elements of Christmas specifically that are pagan in origin rather than strictly Christian. And this is some kind of an own of Christianity, according to the people who put forward these kinds of points. And I want to explore a little bit about that. I think it's a good opportunity to look more deeply at the pagan influences or the influences of other non-Christian, non-monotheist religious beliefs on Christianity and even on Judaism, and look deeply into it and look at why it's maybe not quite the big disaster and existential threat to the legitimacy of monotheistic belief that a lot of atheists seem to think it is. And maybe it really is something that is shattering to a belief system that is radical and fundamentalist, like a lot of modern evangelical Christianity is, and Catholic Christianity is, where it's so rigid and dogmatic that nothing outside of what is 100% Christian can be tolerated. So of course, if there's even an element of pagan influence or influence from some non-Christian or non-monotheistic belief system, it's a huge threat to the consistency and the internal logic of your fundamentalist beliefs. But if we take a more broad-minded view about the human religious experience and what the relationship really is between Christianity and Judaism and monotheism and other forms of religious belief, then suddenly the influence of other cultures, even pagan cultures, on the development of Christianity and of monotheism is not so much of a threat. And it's something which we need to come to grips with if we want to truly understand the phenomenon of monotheism and how it emerged according to archaeology and history and anthropology. So that's really what I want to explore. I want to take the thread of how Christmas is partially a pagan holiday and follow it all the way back to look at all the different ways that pagan cultures have influenced the emergence of monotheism, and monotheistic religion at various points in its history has embraced pagan elements in its own belief, and God has not smote us for that. Actually, by incorporating the best elements of certain pagan beliefs, monotheism has been able to flourish and spread like no other belief system before it. And perhaps there were certain ways about the way we practice religion in the past that we're better off without, which new monotheistic religions tried their best to do away with. But they might not be the things that we expect from paganism. And perhaps modern Christians have thrown away a lot of the trappings and rituals of paganism, but hold on to some very ignorant beliefs that would have been very familiar to the pagan world, and which Christianity was actually an attempt to move beyond. But I'll explore that a little bit later. First, I want to look at what are some of the specific ways that pagan religion or non-monotheistic religion has influenced monotheism. Well, let's begin with the obvious one, which is the celebration of Christmas. So a lot of people think that December 25th is celebrated as Christmas because that's Jesus' birthday. That was only decided quite late in the emergence of the Orthodox Christian faith. not as in Eastern Orthodoxy, but as in the form of Christianity put forth at the Council of Nicaea. But the date of December 25th, or around that time in December, has got a very different significance that predates Christianity, and that is because it marks the winter solstice in the Northern Hemisphere. Here in the Southern Hemisphere it's a bit different. It's hot as hell because the seasons are the opposite, but in the north it's very snowy and very cold. The winter solstice is the coldest and darkest night of the year, and after that time the spring season begins to return, the light begins to return to the world, and the sun, as the giver of life, gives new life to the world that was once dead and cold. And so the symbolism of Christ as the sun was appropriated by Christians, and December 25th became the birth of Christ as the appropriation of the pagan sun god. There are all kinds of parallels between Jesus' story and the stories of other gods, and it is quite possible that the writers of the canonical Gospels, influenced by Hellenistic religion, incorporated these elements from other god stories into the story of the life of Christ. So, for example, Christ's miraculous birth, which I demonstrated in my previous video on the Nativity, probably doesn't have too much basis in historical fact, but it is very similar to some of the stories about the birth of other god figures, such as the Egyptian god Horus, who was miraculously born from his mother Isis after his father Osiris had been dismembered by his jealous brother Set. Another parallel between Jesus and other god figures is that he performed miracles. That's not really that groundbreaking. Kind of goes without saying if you're talking about some kind of spiritual figure. But we also see in the story of Christ a story of the death and resurrection of the God-man. And this is echoed as well in other pagan beliefs. For example, the story of Osiris in ancient Egypt, the story of Dionysus in Greece, and many others. It seems to be quite an archetypal symbol, the dying god who rises again from the dead. And in the example of the Norse god Odin, we actually have Odin hanging from a tree as a sacrifice in one of the stories associated with that god. And it was while he was hanging from the tree that he came up with the system of runes. Another big influence on the Jesus story from pagan cultures, particularly Greek, can be seen in the predominance of the numbers 7 and 12 symbolically throughout the gospel. For example, there were 12 disciples. When Jesus performed the miracle of the fish and loaves, we see again the number 7 and 12 appearing, and Jesus actually saying that there is a mystery associated with those two numbers. And 7 and 12 were very important in the Greek mystery schools that were active at the time that Christ gave his ministry, and directly afterwards and before. The number 7 relates to the 7 planets, and the number 12 relates to the 12 signs of the zodiac. And those two numbers are still significant today in the Hermetic tradition, which ultimately comes from that ancient Greek mystery tradition. The number 12 again links Jesus to the sun, as the sun moved through the 12 signs of the zodiac. So Jesus becomes a stand-in for the sun, where the 12 apostles are the 12 zodiacal signs. This is all, again, indicating that Jesus was intended as a sun god. His identification with the Greek logos, again, draws parallels between Jesus and Apollo, another sun god in pagan antiquity. So we see from very early on in the development of Christianity, from the choice of December 25th as the birthday of Jesus, all the way back to very early with the writing of the canonical Gospels, possibly even to Jesus' own ministry, that there is this influence from the Hellenistic Greek mysteries and other kind of pagan elements in the Jesus story. And there are others that I'll touch upon a little bit later in this video. But in terms of the Christian calendar and the sorts of holidays that are celebrated, of course we also have Easter. This was originally Ostara. It was another festival associated with new life, the renewal of life, which was pagan in origin and got associated with the resurrection only later. Of course, there are also very close relationships between Easter and the Passover festival of the Jewish religion, given that Jesus was crucified around Passover, and to Christians his sacrifice is seen as prefigured in the Passover lamb of Jewish tradition. Another evidence of pagan influence on the development of Christianity is the fact that the Sabbath day in Christianity is a Sunday. In Jewish tradition, the Sabbath was always a Saturday, but it became a Sunday because that's the day of the sun, as is evidenced in the name, Sunday. So of course this again links Jesus back to the mysteries of the solar god from Greek antiquity and antiquity in the Greco-Roman world. A lot of this stuff, most notably the choice of December 25th as Jesus' birthday, can be traced back to the Roman Emperor Constantine. Ironically, the same emperor who tried to standardize what is today considered Christian doctrine through the Council of Nicaea, often considered to be the first Christian emperor, but was actually pagan for much of his life and seemed to use identification with Christianity as a political ploy more than anything else. But there are other ways that we can trace, particularly the influence of Hellenistic pagan beliefs on early Christianity. And we see this quite a bit in the writings of St. Paul. He seems to be very influenced by Hellenistic beliefs, particularly his adoption of the idea of conscience, the law that is written on the heart. This is something which comes from Stoicism, and you could say that there were kind of antecedents of that in a lot of the things that Jewish religion taught, which Paul would be familiar with as a former Pharisee, but it was really the Stoics who started to crystallize and articulate this idea of conscience, or at least they articulated it more clearly than anybody else before them. There are other ancient Greek beliefs which go not back to any books of the Old Testament, but to Plato and others, which made their way into early Christianity and remain there today. One of these is the concept of an ideal world, a world of the good, which exists somewhere beyond this physical world, which is ultimately where divinity derives from, and that pure divinity is to be equated with absolute good. This was something that Plato started to articulate and got appropriated by Christian belief as they were trying to explain their own version of the cosmos. And of course, Plato also talks about the importance of the organizing principle of the logos in the universe, which I've already discussed in terms of its connection to Jesus and who he was as a cosmic being, according to the Christians. But the pagan influence does not end there. In fact, we can go all the way back to the religion of ancient Israel and ancient Judea of the Old Testament and see that even those beliefs were influenced by forms of paganism in the surrounding nations. So, for example, in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Torah in Jewish tradition, attributed to the prophet Moses, we see, unsurprisingly, a lot of Egyptian influence on the law that Moses espoused and other little rites and rituals that made their way into the 5 books of the Pentateuch. We see it all the way down to the detail of the different ceremonial tools and ceremonial equipment that the Hebrews were using during their 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. So, For example, the holy incense that was to be used in the tabernacle, it has very similar ingredients to some of the holy incense that was used in ancient Egypt, most notably frankincense and myrrh as a kind of base. Another Egyptian influence on the Old Testament is actually the Ten Commandments. Few people realize that the Ten Commandments come almost verbatim from an ancient Egyptian text, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which contained a number of spells which was meant to guide the soul of the user through the afterlife, so that they would be found worthy by the gods of spiritual immortality. And in one of the invocations, one of the spells, there is a litany of virtuous actions, or actually negative confessions about actions which are sinful, which the person who is dead has refrained from doing in life. And so there's this list of things that the person has done which should be seen by the gods as favourable and reflecting well on their character. And this is given as a kind of appeal to why this person deserves eternal life. And the Ten Commandments and the list of 10 commandments is very, very similar to this list that appears in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And even though ancient Greece and ancient Egypt were pagan civilizations, much to the ire of Christians, they were once great and noble civilizations which possessed incredible wisdom, which actually is not only compatible with what we know today as monotheism, but actually influenced the emergence of that belief system as an alternative to some of the more barbaric forms of religion that were practiced by the nations surrounding Canaan. And, we don't think of Egypt or Greece in those favourable terms today. We think of those ancient civilizations as very wicked because of the way that they are portrayed in the Bible. But the time at which those civilizations were portrayed in that light, you have to understand, is at a time when those civilizations had grown decadent and they had grown very morally and socially degenerate and fallen into evil ways, where before there was a spirit of goodness that motivated them. They weren't evil just because they practiced pagan religion. That is too simplistic. In fact, the belief that there is only one God, or at the very least that there is one God that is supreme above all of the others, could have actually come not from Judaism, but from ancient Egyptian religion again, and from ancient Persian religion. So, in ancient Egypt, a very close time to the time of the Exodus, there was the arising of the pharaoh Amenhotep IV, who changed his name to Akhenaten and tried to institute a form of monotheism, arguably for the first time in history, by raising up Aten, the solar disk, as the one true God, and trying to ban all other forms of worship of other gods. He was quickly brought to heel by his political rivals, and the Egyptian polytheistic status quo was restored. But we also see in ancient Persia there was the arising of the belief system of Zoroastrianism, which said that there were two contending forces in the universe. One force of absolute good, which was Ahura Mazda, and one force of absolute evil, which was Angra, and that these were the two true spiritual forces. You might have seen or noticed that this is not actually monotheism, it's a form of dualism where there's two equally balanced forces, but this idea that there was one absolute God of the good in the form of Ahura Mazda could have actually influenced the emergence of Jewish belief about the supremacy of one God. And that influence could have happened while the Israelites and the tribe of Judah were in exile in what would become the Persian Empire, which was dominated by Zoroastrianism at the time of that exile. There was plenty of time for the exchange of ideas. And of course, the influence of Egyptian culture on Israelite religion dating all the way back to the time of Exodus has already been covered in this video. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that at one point in their history, the Israelites or the Hebrews were in fact a polytheistic people. They worshipped other gods such as the Canaanite gods Baal and Asherah and El, who was actually the god that Abraham originally followed, and that later on, only in about 600 BC, did we start to see the clear emergence of the idea that there was one God that was supreme above all others. But that idea took some time to be established, and it perhaps occurred much later than we're led to believe by the mainstream narrative of the Old Testament. There's little hints that this was once the case in the original Hebrew of the Old Testament, of the Pentateuch, where we see references to the Elohim. This word gets translated as singular God, but it's actually a plural referring to the gods. And the God who would eventually become the one supreme God was not even originally an Israelite God, was not even the original God of Abraham. It was in fact the God Yahweh, who was likely a Midianite deity, a desert god who was very wrathful and very warlike, compared to the Most High God of El. But it was the cult of Yahweh that gained ascendance in the first millennium BCE, and it was Yahweh who supplanted all of the other gods and who became equated with the one God. And part of the way that Yahweh was able to do this was by absorbing the attributes and qualities of the other gods that he replaced, such as the god Baal, who was a storm god. Yahweh replaced Baal and absorbed the qualities of that god, being a storm god and a bringer of storms. And then there are the stories in Genesis, centering around the creation of the human race all the way up to the Great Flood. These also have a pre-Israelite origin and are very closely paralleled in the stories of the creation of the human race by the Sumerian gods, in the case of Adam and Eve, but also the story of the Great Flood of Noah is very similar to the story of the Epic of Gilgamesh from Sumerian and Mesopotamian mythology. And in fact, there is a story of a great flood across practically every culture on Earth. But there are many elements of the Noah story that seem to be borrowed from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Another intriguing pagan rite which made its way into the Bible is that of the Hieros Gamos ritual of the Near East. Hieros Gamos translates to a sacred marriage or a sacred union. The most notable example of this is the part of the coronation ritual or rituals of the ancient kings of Babylon was a wedding feast with the king's bride, and this would be followed by a sacred union in the bridal chamber to represent the union of the goddess Inanna with her human lover. And so it was this union with divinity through the sacred union of the Hieros Gamos rite which conferred holy kingship on the new king. And we see this echoed in the kingship of the Davidic line and also the kingship of Christ in multiple places, as well as in reference to God's own kingship. So in the case of the Davidic line, we can see in the Song of Solomon that there appears to be a Hieros Gamos type of a rite that is being spoken of here, which is a reference to the sacred marriage between the king and his bride. Solomon, of course, being one of the kings of Israel and a son of David. And we see this tradition of the Hieros Gamos rite as set out in the Song of Solomon seemingly echoed in the Gospels with the story of the woman with the alabaster jar, where she anoints Christ before the final chapters of the Gospel story with an aromatic perfume of spikenard. This very same spikenard appears in the Song of Solomon as a symbol of the love between the bride and her bridegroom. And so through the medium of the Song of Solomon, we have a symbolism tying Christ's own ministry and his own divine kingship back to ancient Babylonian practices. The woman who anointed Jesus with the oil of spikenard was believed to have been Mary Magdalene. That raises questions as to who Mary Magdalene was in relation to Jesus, if the spikenard oil was supposed to represent the love between the king and his bride. But that is a whole other can of worms, that is a whole other video or series of videos in its own right. And we see references of the triumph of the Messianic king in several prophecies referred to in terms of the marriage supper of the Lamb, which is again a reference to the sacred marriage rite of the divine king. And so the marriage supper of the Lamb is used as a literary device to say that it's referring to a time of the return of the king. And as I've said, we see this echoed in drawing parallels between God and the nation of Israel as being symbols of the bride and bridegroom throughout the Bible, but particularly in the book of Hosea. So that is a crash course in all of the different ways that what would be regarded as pagan beliefs have actually influenced the emergence of monotheism over time. And each one of those topics deserves a video in its own right, in my opinion. Maybe that's something I'll do. If that's something that you would be interested in, we'll see. Let me know. But what are we supposed to take away from all of this? Well, I think there is something that sets some of the monotheistic forms of religion apart from the religions that went before. And it's really this kind of idea that God is one, and that God is this incorporeal kind of a principle, moving away from the graven images of the past. And I think the other thing that makes monotheism special is the way that it embraces this kind of radical love, this radical compassion for other human beings, which extends to actually wanting to change the world for the better, and having a line of history that is linear and progressive, rather than just going through the same cycles over and over again and nothing ever changing unless you manage to escape the cycle of incarnation, which is what we see in other forms of religion. So these are things that are quite special about monotheism, and a kind of an attempt to have a more kind of abstract and sophisticated idea of what divinity is, moving away from the more superstitious forms of religion that were being followed by some of the nations that surrounded Canaan, and also, practice some pretty, what would be regarded as inhumane kinds of practices, such as the kinds of sacrifices that they engaged in, which I'll probably get demonetized if I mention in greater detail. Recognizing the inherent value of the human being, of the human spirit, and recognizing the kind of the implicit order in the universe, which was implied by the existence of the monotheistic God, motivated an attempt to understand the world by really observing and understanding the physical universe rather than relying on superstitious beliefs. And so the original motivation for discarding earlier pagan beliefs by the Christians and even the Israelites was trying to move away from these unfavorable elements of the pagan forms of belief. It wasn't to just completely disregard paganism as having anything of worth, or if it was, then this is a very short-sighted view which ignores the pagan inheritance of a lot of the elements of monotheism. And so when we understand the true history of monotheism, we can start to no longer see everything that is pagan, everything that is pre-Christian or non-Christian with an attitude of fear and wanting to exclude that from our beliefs, because that's completely missing the point. And I would argue that at a time when many forms of monotheistic religion, at least in the Western world, are on the decline, that monotheism would do well to do what it's always done and look at ways that it can incorporate the very best of other forms of belief. Look at Vedic religion, the idea of Brahman, the one supreme God. I mean, surely that's something that can be incorporated into a broader monotheism. Surely that's something that's compatible with the ideas of what God is that are espoused by what we know today as Western monotheism. And surely it would be better to embrace aspects of Vedic religion that enrich our understanding of God, particularly the science of the soul, that is meditation and yoga, than to just discard all of that to the flames. I mean, what a waste of human spiritual knowledge to have such a sectarian outlook. How is that different to incorporating ancient Greek Platonic beliefs? How is that different to incorporating ancient Egyptian beliefs, or ancient Mesopotamian beliefs, or ancient Persian beliefs? If we're really worried about the way that earlier forms of paganism might infiltrate Christianity or monotheism and turn it into something much darker and ignorant than what it was intended to be, we should be looking at ways that Christians today engage in superstitious behaviors and perpetuate superstitious beliefs. Like that tarot cards are a gateway to the devil somehow, like a pack of cards can open doorways to hell, and nonsense like that, which is a kind of level of superstitious nonsense that would give the Greek pagans reason to be embarrassed for the Christians. So do we really want to hold on to that? What about the tribalism that is encouraged? What about the way that horrible acts of violence are justified in the name of religion as a worthy sacrifice of life for some ideal, such as we continue to see many forms of monotheism engaging in today? Does that not bear similarities to the bloodletting that occurred in the pagan rites of our dark past? These are the real reasons why Israelite religion, Christianity, were trying to separate themselves from paganism. These are the things we should be discarding from our ideas about God and religion. Not reading tarot or whatever else it is. Anything can be used as a tool for the forces of evil, whether it is a superficially pagan kind of a thing or not. And in fact, there are many Christians in the world who, even though they invoke the name of Jesus daily, actually, because of what is in their heart and what is in their soul, have made of themselves instruments of the evil one. And if you need any evidence of that, just go and watch the documentary Jesus Camp. And why is it that the disciples of Satan always seem so hell-bent on indoctrinating children? It seems to be something of a pattern. And it's repeated again, as you'll see in that documentary. Are these really people that are motivated by a spirit that is faithful to the God of love that they claim to profess loyalty to? I don't think so. So to me, those are the big lessons that we can learn by looking into the pagan influence on Christmas and the pagan influences on monotheism more generally. Thanks again for listening, as per usual. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, subscribe to my channel if you want to support my work, and subscribe to my Odyssey as well. And have a Merry Christmas, or a Happy Saturnalia, or whatever you're celebrating this year, and I'll see you next time.